It was the kind of morning that looked ordinary on the surface. The sun rose slowly over acres of farmland, spreading across the weathered fences, the sagging roof of the family barn, and the dew-damp grass. For the Harris family, this was life as usual. The father had left early to check on equipment, the mother was inside starting breakfast, and their 14-year-old daughter, Emily, had slipped on her boots to handle the chickens. She had done it 100 times before. But on this morning in July of 2012, the rhythm broke in a way no one could have imagined. Emily was the middle child of 3, a quiet girl with a sharp mind and a love for animals. Neighbors described her as the one who always stayed behind after church to help stack chairs, or the one who carried kittens tucked inside her sweater. That morning, she moved through the yard carrying a small bucket of feed, scattering grain as the hens clucked around her ankles. The last clear sighting of her was simple, almost mundane, a girl in faded jeans, standing in the early light with chickens circling her boots. From there, the story changed forever. Her mother, Sarah, called from the porch not long after. Breakfast was nearly ready, and Sarah expected her daughter to come in, wash up and take her usual seat at the table. But no answer came. At first, it was nothing unusual. Kids on farms wander. They check the garden, the creek, the barn. Sarah's voice carried again across the yard, louder this time. Still, silence. She walked toward the barn, expecting to see her daughter stacking tools or fiddling with ropes the way she often did. But when she pulled open the heavy doors, the space was empty. The buckets, the hay, the smell of dust and animals, all there. Emily wasn't. Within minutes, Sarah was shouting her daughter's name. The younger siblings were told to check the house. The father returned from the far field, confusion written across his face as he realized what his wife was saying. Their daughter was gone. The initial search was frantic, but focused. They fanned out across the property, combing the orchard, the garden rows, the small creek that cut behind the barn. They expected to find her crouched somewhere, distracted, maybe lost in thought. Instead, every corner returned nothing. It was as though she had stepped into thin air. The first hour was filled with disbelief. The family shouted themselves hoarse, convinced she would appear. But time on farms is measured differently. There are chores, livestock, routines that mark each moment, and as more minutes passed, the absence became undeniable. Sarah ran inside and called the sheriff's office. Her words were rushed, desperate. Her 14-year-old daughter was missing, last seen in the yard, headed toward the barn. No one had seen her leave. No one had heard a thing. Deputies arrived quickly, aware that in rural disappearances, the first hours are critical. They took statements, marking the timeline with precision. Emily was last seen around 7:45 a.m. Her mother called for her just after 8:00. By 8:15, the family was already searching. By 8:30, law enforcement was on site. That tight frame of time should have narrowed possibilities. But standing there in the yard, investigators faced a haunting problem. No footprints beyond the barn, no signs of a struggle, no tracks on the gravel drive. Just emptiness where a girl had been. Neighbors were alerted, and soon vehicles pulled into the dirt lane leading to the farm. Friends from church, nearby farmers, even people who barely knew the family stepped out to help. They scoured the cornfields, shouting her name into the rustling leaves. They walked along the creek bed, scanning for clothing, shoes, any trace. But the farther they searched, the more unsettling the silence became. Emily was not the type to vanish. She was cautious, not adventurous. Running away didn't fit. Getting lost didn't fit. Yet, she was gone. By late morning, tension on the farm was rising to panic. Sarah clutched her younger children as deputies questioned her again and again. Was there any chance Emily had a friend she might have gone to meet? Was there conflict at home? Any sign she might have wanted to leave? The answers remained steady. No, this wasn't like her. The girl had been feeding chickens 1 minute and was gone the next. There was no sense to it. Deputies focused briefly on the barn, the last place she was seen heading. They walked through its aisles, checked the loft, tested the doors and windows. Nothing stood out. It was an old structure, filled with shadows and tools, but empty. They closed the doors again, marking it off as searched. Yet to those who lived there, the barn began to take on an unshakable weight. It was the last known link to her, the place she should have been, but wasn't. By the end of that day, search teams had expanded their perimeter. Helicopters scanned from above, while volunteers on horseback covered miles of open land. For the family, each hour felt like a lifetime. Hope flickered each time a deputy returned from the field, only to collapse when they shook their head. Nothing. No trace. Emily had vanished into the stillness of her own home ground, and the farm that once felt safe now carried a shadow. What no one knew then was that the search would stretch not just into days, but years, and the barn that seemed empty would remain locked in silence, holding a secret no one could see. The first hours after Emily's disappearance were consumed by shock and disbelief, but by midday, the reality set in with full force. This wasn't a case of a distracted child hiding in the hayloft or wandering too far into the fields. Something was wrong. Deputies called in reinforcements, and before long, the quiet farm was swarming with people. Uniformed officers, neighbors, extended family, and volunteers from the surrounding community. The land that had always been private and familiar was suddenly transformed into the center of a desperate search. They began with the immediate property. The house was searched from attic to basement, each room turned upside down. Drawers, closets, crawl spaces, every space was examined with grim urgency. Outside, volunteers moved in tight lines through the fields, careful not to miss a patch of tall grass. Others spread toward the creek bed that cut along the far edge of the property. Its muddy banks searched for signs of disturbance. Deputies climbed fences into neighboring parcels, asking permission to check barns, sheds, and hunting blinds. It was as if the entire county had been alerted, and each person knew that in missing child cases, every second mattered. By afternoon, specialized teams had arrived. Bloodhounds were brought in, their handlers lowering their heads to sniff an item of Emily's clothing. The dogs pulled hard at their leashes, noses low to the ground as they tracked the scent across the yard. Hearts lifted as the dogs pulled with certainty toward the barn. But then, without warning, they faltered. They circled near the large wooden doors, whining and pacing, then stopped. Handlers tried again, giving them different pieces of clothing, but the result was the same. The scent led them straight to the barn and ended there. No continuation down the road, no trail into the woods. Just a dead stop at the barn doors. It was the first chilling detail that froze the deputies in their tracks. Detectives pushed into the barn once more. They scoured the interior with flashlights, testing the floors for loose boards, pressing against the walls for hidden gaps. They climbed into the loft, sifting through hay, checking for concealed spaces where a child might hide or be hidden. Yet, nothing revealed itself. The barn looked old, worn, and ordinary, with the same dust and tools that had always been there. It was as though the building itself had swallowed her whole, and no one could explain how. Theories started forming almost immediately. Some investigators leaned toward abduction. The lack of footprints or vehicle tracks suggested someone careful and experienced. Maybe a predator who knew the land, slipped in, and lured her toward the barn before vanishing with her. Others wondered if she had climbed into a vehicle willingly, someone she knew, someone she trusted. But that theory clashed with the timeline. The family insisted there hadn't been enough time for her to vanish so completely. She had been called inside only minutes after finishing her chores. To believe she had left willingly or been taken meant believing it had happened in the narrowest of windows, right under her family's noses. As night fell, the search expanded outward. A command post was set up near the farmhouse, its blinking lights casting a strange glow on the yard. Volunteers returned with flashlights, combing the orchard, circling the pond, dragging hooks along the water's edge. Deputies walked shoulder to shoulder through the cornfields, calling her name into the rustling leaves. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their searchlights sweeping across the land, illuminating patches of fields and treetops. The entire farm seemed under siege by sound and light, yet the silence of Emily's absence cut through it all. Neighbors remembered the fear in Sarah's voice as she stood on the porch, wringing her hands, eyes fixed on the barn as if it might finally give her daughter back. The father worked alongside deputies, refusing to stop even as exhaustion set in. Every few hours, searchers would gather at the command post, only to shake their heads. There was nothing. No torn clothing, no dropped belongings, not even a footprint that could be identified as hers. It was as though she had vanished into a pocket of air that no one could see. The dogs were brought out again the next morning, but the result was unchanged. Each time they locked onto the same spot, the barn doors. Beyond that, nothing. To some, it felt like a cruel riddle. To others, it was a sign. Something had happened there, something that explained why the trail went cold at that exact location. But without physical evidence, detectives were left with only suspicions. In the following days, law enforcement worked tirelessly. Roadblocks were set up on nearby highways. Officers questioned anyone who might have driven past the farm that morning. They interviewed relatives, farmhands, delivery drivers, and neighbors. Some leads trickled in, rumors of a suspicious truck, an unfamiliar man seen walking near a field, but each proved either unverifiable or false. The frustration grew, not only for investigators, but for a community unaccustomed to such darkness. This was farmland, not a city. Children weren't supposed to vanish from their own yards in broad daylight. As the search dragged on, the emotional weight settled heavily on the Harris family. Emily's siblings clung to their mother, confused by the sudden flood of strangers trampling through their yard. Sarah refused to sleep, convinced her daughter was somewhere nearby, waiting to be found. The father grew silent, his hands raw from days of searching, his face hollowed by sleepless nights. Every time they passed the barn, their eyes lingered on it. Unable to forget that the dogs had stopped there, unable to shake the feeling that whatever had happened, it had started or ended at that place. By the end of that first week, the operation began to shift. The large-scale searches gave way to smaller, more targeted efforts. Detectives focused on interviews, backgrounds, and the troubling absence of evidence. Volunteers slowly returned to their routines, though none could look at the farm the same way again. Something had happened on that land, and no one could explain it. And at the center of it all stood the barn, silent, ordinary, but holding on to a secret it refused to share. In the days that followed Emily's disappearance, the farm that had once been alive with the sounds of chores and children's laughter turned into a place of hushed speculation and whispered conversations. With every passing hour, the absence of evidence grew heavier. It wasn't just that no one could find her. It was that no one could even explain how a girl could vanish so completely from her own yard in broad daylight. That silence gave way to theories, each one more desperate than the last. The first theory to gain traction was the simplest. Maybe she had run away. Teenagers, after all, are unpredictable. Deputies leaned hard on the possibility, questioning her parents about arguments in the home, signs of rebellion, or secrets she might have kept. But Sarah and her husband rejected the idea immediately. Emily wasn't a runaway. She had left behind her shoes, her backpack, even the necklace she wore every day. There was no note, no money missing, no plan in motion. To them, the idea of her running away was not only wrong, it was insulting. Still, investigators could not rule it out. They combed through her phone records, her emails, her social media, searching for hidden friendships or messages. Nothing pointed toward an escape. Her digital trail was as blank as the fields surrounding the farm. As the runaway theory lost credibility, suspicion turned outward. Talk of abduction spread quickly. Parents in the area clutched their children tighter, imagining a stranger lurking near the farm, waiting for the right moment to strike. But if a predator had taken her, how had they done it so quietly? The lack of tire tracks or footprints baffled detectives. Still, they checked the registry of known offenders, questioning and tracking every person with a record of violence in the county. Each alibi checked out, each lead collapsed. The fear remained, but proof never came. With the larger theories faltering, suspicion began creeping closer to home. Investigators studied the people who had access to the farm, relatives, friends, and especially the men who had worked there over the years. Farmhands came under quiet scrutiny. Some were seasonal workers who drifted in and out. Some had been around for years. Detectives questioned each one, searching for inconsistencies. While none admitted to anything unusual, rumors sparked in the community. Was there one who had lingered a little too long around the children? One who had taken an unusual interest in Emily? The family bristled at the implications, but investigators could not ignore the possibilities. Background checks were run, surveillance was tightened. Still, nothing surfaced. Even the neighbors weren't safe from speculation. In small towns, familiarity is often a comfort, but in the shadow of a disappearance, it becomes a weapon. People asked each other uncomfortable questions. Who was near the farm that morning? Who drove past? Who was acting differently in the days since? Deputies followed up on dozens of tips, knocking on doors, sitting in kitchens, examining alibis. The community that had once been united by trust was slowly unraveling into suspicion. For the Harris family, the theories were devastating. Each one not only failed to bring their daughter home, but introduced new layers of doubt and guilt. If she had run away, what did that say about their home? If she had been abducted, how could they not have seen or heard something? And if the suspicion truly fell on someone they knew, someone who had shared meals with them, worked beside them, what did that mean about the life they had built on this land? Every scenario left them questioning themselves as much as everyone else. Detectives remained methodical, documenting each theory, testing each lead, but progress stalled. No theory advanced beyond speculation. The case notes were filled with what-ifs and dead ends, a growing web of possibilities with no center. Each time, investigators thought they had something: a vehicle sighting, a vague description, a rumor whispered by a neighbor. It unraveled under scrutiny. The frustration mounted, and with it, the tension inside the family home grew unbearable. As weeks passed, the theories became less about truth and more about survival. People needed an explanation, however fragile, to make sense of the senseless. For some, the runaway story provided distance. It was easier to believe she had chosen to leave than to imagine something darker. For others, abduction fit the fear they already carried about strangers. And for those closest to the family, suspicion of insiders gnawed at the edges of trust. The truth was out there, but buried under a tangle of stories that only deepened the mystery. Through it all, the barn remained the quiet center of speculation. Deputies had cleared it repeatedly, found nothing suspicious, and moved on. But locals kept circling back. It was the last place she had been heading, the point where the dogs lost the trail, the shadow that loomed over every theory. No matter how many explanations were suggested, none could push aside the image of a girl walking toward a barn and never being seen again. From the very beginning, the barn stood at the center of the mystery. It was the last place Emily had been seen heading, the point where the dogs had lost her scent, and the structure that dominated every view of the property. Deputies couldn't ignore it, and they didn't. They went back to it again and again, treating it as if it must hold the answer. But each time they emerged, they carried only dust on their boots and frustration in their faces. The barn never spoke. The searches were meticulous. Investigators swept through the main floor with flashlights, checking between stacks of hay, moving tools, and opening feed bins. They climbed into the loft, shining beams into corners, testing the boards for hollows or hidden compartments. They dragged rakes through loose hay, hoping to uncover clothing or objects buried underneath. Nothing ever appeared. The barn was large but unremarkable, an aging structure of weathered wood, warped boards, and the ordinary contents of a working farm. Deputies reported finding nothing out of place, no signs of a struggle, no discarded belongings, no trace of Emily. To the family, those words were unbearable. If the barn held nothing, then what explanation was left? Sarah found herself staring at its doors late at night, convinced the building was mocking her silence with its own. Neighbors noticed the same feeling. For them, the barn became less a structure and more a symbol. It was where Emily's trail ended, and so it carried the weight of her disappearance. Whispers grew in the community, parents warning their children not to linger near it. "That's where she vanished," they said. "Don't go near those doors." As weeks turned into months, the barn's presence only deepened the unease. Deputies ordered it searched repeatedly, each time bringing in new sets of eyes, convinced something had been missed. Forensic teams used luminol sprays to check for traces of blood. They examined the floors for unusual scratches, the walls for signs of recent repair. They even considered whether someone could have concealed an opening beneath the structure. The tests came back negative. The boards showed nothing. No secret compartments, no stains, no anomalies. Every effort ended the same way, with the barn standing empty, unyielding. But to locals, that emptiness was its own kind of evidence. They asked the questions law enforcement couldn't answer. How could a scent trail end at a set of doors if she hadn't gone inside? If she had entered, how could she have left without being seen? The lack of answers only heightened the sense that the barn was hiding something deeper. Even children who had once played tag around its walls began to cross the road rather than walk past it. The building became a boundary line between ordinary life and the unexplained. The Harris family felt the weight more than anyone. Every chore on the farm drew them near the barn, and every time they saw it, grief resurfaced. They had known the structure their whole lives. It had stored their hay, sheltered their animals, even served as the backdrop for family photographs. But after Emily vanished, it became unbearable to enter. Sarah avoided it entirely. Her husband forced himself inside when necessary, but always quickly, never lingering. The younger siblings whispered about monsters in the rafters. To them, the barn was no longer just part of home. It was the place that had taken their sister. Investigators, for all their skepticism, couldn't fully let go either. They brought cadaver dogs on multiple occasions, hoping that perhaps decomposition had left some trace hidden from human eyes. Each time, the dogs reacted with interest near the entrance, then lost the trail again. The handlers shook their heads, unable to explain the consistency of the result. The barn became a puzzle that resisted every method used to solve it. It was searched more times than any other location tied to the case, and still it revealed nothing. Over time, the official focus of the investigation shifted outward, to theories about abduction, to interviews with possible suspects, to background checks of farmhands and neighbors. But the barn never fully disappeared from people's minds. It sat there, weathering storms, its boards creaking with age, while the case grew colder. Each time a news story revisited the disappearance, the image they used was the same. The wide, looming barn, doors closed, standing like a monument to something no one could explain. The silence surrounding it changed the way locals spoke about the case. People didn't just say Emily had vanished from her farm. They said she had vanished from the barn. They said it with lowered voices, as if the building itself might overhear. Parents told their children not to play there, not to step too close, as if something within it might still be waiting. And as years passed, the whispers grew. The barn had been searched more thoroughly than any building in the county, yet its connection to Emily's last known moments remained inescapable. It was the place where her trail ended, the place that stood mute, refusing to yield its secret. Time has a way of stretching thin when no answers come. Days turned into weeks, then months, and still nothing broke the silence around Emily's disappearance. The official search efforts dwindled. Deputies who had once crowded the farm returned to other cases, and the command post that had lit up the yard was packed away. What remained was an investigation frozen in place, open, but with no direction to follow. The case was, in every sense, cold. Inside the Harris home, nothing moved forward. Emily's bedroom stayed exactly as she had left it. Her bed was made, her clothes folded neatly in the dresser, her school bag still hung on its hook by the door. Sarah dusted the room weekly, but changed nothing, convinced that if her daughter returned, she would want it just as it had been. The family clung to these rituals like lifelines. For them, letting go of any detail felt like giving up. And giving up was unthinkable. Yet as months passed, the weight of the silence became heavier. The youngest siblings grew quieter. The father worked longer hours on the fields, avoiding the house whenever he could. Sarah carried the brunt of the waiting, each day slipping by without resolution. In town, the case never disappeared from conversation. Locals speculated endlessly, often in hushed tones in diners and church parking lots. Sightings were reported in distant states. A girl resembling Emily seen in a truck stop in Missouri, another said to be walking along a highway in Kentucky. Each lead sparked a brief flare of hope, only to collapse under scrutiny. When investigators followed up, the supposed sightings always unraveled. The girls in question were someone else's children or no one at all. Each false report left the Harris family raw with fresh heartbreak, reopening wounds that never had time to heal. As years went by, the whispers shifted. Some said Emily had been taken far from the farm and was living under another name. Others clung to the runaway theory, believing she had chosen to disappear and simply didn't want to be found. A darker current suggested she had been killed that very morning, her body hidden somewhere no one had thought to search. These theories circulated endlessly, but none carried proof. They were stories people told to try to make sense of the impossible. The truth remained, locked away. The barn became the most enduring symbol of the mystery. Its weathered boards grew more warped with each passing season, its roof sagging under the weight of snow in winter and baking under the summer sun. Neighbors driving by could not help but glance at it, a building so ordinary yet tied forever to the last known moments of a missing child. Some swore they felt uneasy when passing, as though the barn carried a memory it refused to release. Children dared each other to approach its doors, but rarely followed through. It was a landmark of silence, a place forever marked by what hadn't been found. For the family, the barn was unbearable. Sarah refused to step inside after that summer, and her husband kept it locked whenever possible. It stood on their property, unavoidable yet avoided, a daily reminder of what they had lost. Every time they crossed the yard, its presence loomed, unspoken but heavy. They couldn't tear it down, it was still needed for the farm, but they also couldn't see it as anything but the last known witness to their daughter's life. In the evenings, Sarah sometimes caught herself staring at it from the kitchen window, willing it to reveal something. It never did. 8 birthdays came and went without Emily. Each year, her absence was marked by a cake that went uneaten, a chair at the table left empty. Photographs of her grew older, even as she did not. Her friends moved on, graduating high school, leaving town for college, starting jobs. But Emily's story stayed frozen at 14, trapped in that morning where she disappeared. For her parents, the hardest part was living with questions that had no end. Was she alive? Was she suffering? Or had she been gone from the very start? The lack of answers was its own kind of torment, a wound that could not close. By the 8th year, the farm was quieter than ever. The siblings had grown, the father worn thin by time and work, Sarah a shadow of the woman she had once been. The barn still stood, locked and weathered, its boards groaning in the wind. To outsiders, it was just an old farm building. To locals, it remained the heart of a haunting story. To the family, it was the last place their daughter's trail had touched. And no matter how much time passed, the silence surrounding it only deepened the sense that something was still there, waiting, hidden just beyond reach. 8 years had passed since the morning Emily vanished, and the Harris farm had changed in ways that went beyond weather and seasons. The family had endured as long as they could, but the land had become unbearable. Every fence post, every row of crops, every glance at the barn was a reminder of what they had lost. The farm no longer felt like a home. It felt like a graveyard of memories that refused to let them breathe. Selling was not a decision they made lightly, but when the paperwork was signed, the family walked away with quiet resignation, leaving behind the place where their daughter had last been seen. The new owners were outsiders, a couple who saw the farm not as a site of tragedy but as a project, a fresh start. They knew of the history, everyone in the county did, but to them, the property's value outweighed the shadows attached to it. Their plans were ambitious. They intended to restore the house, modernize the outbuildings, and bring life back to the land. The barn, sagging and weathered from years of neglect, was at the top of their list. They wanted it repaired, cleaned out, and made useful again. The renovation began with tearing down old boards, clearing clutter, and replacing beams that had rotted with time. Workers filled the structure daily, their saws and hammers replacing the silence that had hung over the barn for nearly a decade. Dust rose into the rafters, light streamed through gaps that hadn't been exposed in years, and corners long forgotten were finally brought back into view. To the workers, it was routine maintenance. To the community, it was a disruption of something that had been left untouched for reasons no one spoke aloud. It was during one of these ordinary workdays that the discovery was made. A pair of laborers were tasked with removing a section of interior paneling along the back wall. The boards had warped with age, and behind them was a gap that looked out of place. As they pried away the planks, more space appeared. What they revealed was not the solid wall they expected, but the outline of something concealed. The moment the opening widened, the air seemed to shift. The men stepped back confused, shining their flashlights into the void. What they saw inside froze them in place. Behind the false wall was a narrow, hidden chamber. It was cramped and dark, no more than a few feet wide, sealed off from the rest of the barn. Inside, dust coated every surface, but objects lay scattered on the floor. Old food wrappers, a mattress thin and stained, scraps of rope, and clothing small enough to belong to a child. One sweatshirt in particular caught their attention. Faded and worn, its color almost unrecognizable from age, but to those who knew the story, it matched the description of what Emily Harris had been wearing on the morning she disappeared. The workers stared in stunned silence, realizing they had stumbled into something far beyond routine renovation. The sheriff's office was called immediately. Deputies arrived within the hour, sealing the property off with tape and ordering the workers to leave. The barn that had stood silent for 8 years was suddenly the focus of flashing lights and hushed voices once again. Investigators stepped carefully into the hidden room, photographing every inch, cataloging every item. The mattress, the wrappers, the ropes, the sweatshirt, each piece was bagged as evidence. Forensic teams moved with grim efficiency, aware of the weight of what they were uncovering. The space itself told a story no one had been prepared to face. Word spread quickly through the community. By nightfall, people gathered along the edge of the property, whispering as they watched the barn lit up by police floodlights. Parents clutched their children, shaking their heads in disbelief. For years, the barn had been the center of speculation, the silent witness to Emily's disappearance. Now, it had finally given up part of its secret. The locals who once avoided its doors now stared at them, haunted by the thought that the truth had been hidden inside all along, sealed behind boards just feet from where searchers had stood 8 years earlier. For the Harris family, the call from authorities reopened every wound at once. They had sold the farm to escape its weight, but it seemed the land had never let go of their daughter. The discovery shattered what little distance they had tried to create. The barn they had locked and avoided, the one they had left behind, had been holding the very thing they had searched for. And as investigators worked into the night, the realization sank in across town. The mystery was no longer a story of absence. The barn had finally spoken, and what it revealed was only the beginning. The discovery of the hidden room changed everything. For nearly a decade, investigators had been told the barn was clean, searched, and cleared of any connection to Emily's disappearance. But as the workers peeled back the warped boards, what emerged was not an empty void, but a space deliberately concealed. It was small, suffocatingly so, barely large enough for a child to sit or lie down in. The air inside was stale, heavy with dust, as if sealed from the world since the day it was built. What lay scattered on the floor was even more unsettling. At the center of the cramped chamber sat a thin mattress, so worn it looked as though it had been dragged from a roadside discard. Its surface was discolored, the fabric stiff from age. Around it, food wrappers littered the ground, fast food bags, crumpled chip packets, soda cans long dried. These were not relics of the farm. They were the kind of items someone would have brought in from outside, one by one, over time. And then there were the restraints. Pieces of rope, some knotted, some frayed, left abandoned in the corner. They were not farming tools, not spare supplies. They carried a purpose that chilled everyone who looked at them. But the object that stopped investigators cold was the sweatshirt. It was small, faded from its original bright color, but unmistakable. In 2012, when Emily Harris was reported missing, her parents described her clothing in detail: jeans, worn boots, and a sweatshirt with a pale blue design. The sweatshirt in the hidden chamber matched that description exactly. Even after 8 years of dust and decay, it was clear. It was hers. The sheriff's office moved quickly to secure the scene. Deputies strung tape across the barn doors, blocking access as forensic teams worked in shifts. Photographs were taken from every angle, measurements logged, samples collected. They documented each wrapper, each rope fiber, each stain on the mattress. Evidence bags filled steadily, each one carrying a piece of a story that had been hidden in plain sight for nearly a decade. Detectives stood outside the barn in disbelief, their faces pale under the harsh floodlights. This was not just evidence. This was the first tangible proof that Emily had been inside that barn after she disappeared. News traveled fast. By evening, the discovery was all anyone in town could talk about. Crowds gathered at the edge of the property, their voices low, their expressions grim. Some whispered about what it meant, that she had been held there, that the barn wasn't just a symbol of mystery, but a literal prison. Others shook their heads, unwilling to let their minds go that far. But no one could deny what the evidence suggested. Emily had not been taken far from home. She had been there, hidden behind a false wall while her family searched only feet away. For Sarah and her husband, the news was unbearable. When detectives called to confirm the findings, Sarah collapsed. For years she had begged authorities to look again at the barn, insisting it was the last place her daughter had gone. Now, the confirmation brought no relief, only torment. Her daughter had been right there, locked away while deputies walked past, while bloodhounds circled and lost the trail at the very doors that concealed her. The sense of betrayal was overwhelming, not only by whoever had built that room, but by the investigation that had failed to see it. For investigators, the discovery raised as many questions as it answered. Who had constructed the false wall? It wasn't a temporary hiding spot. The carpentry was deliberate, the boards nailed and aged to match the rest of the structure. Whoever built it had knowledge of the barn and enough time to create a concealed chamber without raising suspicion. Why hadn't earlier searches detected it? Deputies defended their past work, explaining that the wall had looked original, the boards weathered in line with the rest of the barn. Without reason to suspect it, no one had thought to tear it open. Now, that oversight loomed large. The hidden room became the new heart of the investigation. Forensic teams searched for DNA, fingerprints, and fibers. They bagged soil samples from beneath the boards, hoping to detect traces of decomposition. They tested every object, from the wrappers to the ropes, for genetic material that might tie them to a suspect. Even the dust was collected, sifted for hair or skin cells. Detectives knew that after 8 years, much of the evidence might be degraded, but they also knew that any fragment could hold the key to identifying who had kept Emily in that space. As news outlets picked up the story, shock rippled far beyond the county. National reporters arrived, filming the barn and interviewing locals who spoke with haunted eyes about the years of speculation. To the world, the case was a chilling reminder of how easily secrets could hide in plain sight. To the people of the town, it was worse. Proof that they had lived for 8 years beside a silent witness to terror, never realizing the truth. The barn had been searched, cleared, and dismissed countless times, but the whole time, its secret had been sealed just beyond reach. The hidden room was no longer speculation, no longer rumor. It was fact. Emily had been there, and with that realization, the case was no longer cold. It was burning again, with a new and horrifying clarity. When forensic teams stepped into the hidden room, the atmosphere was different than any other search they had conducted on the farm. This was no longer a matter of speculation or rumor. For the first time in 8 years, they were standing inside a space that undeniably connected to Emily Harris. The objects scattered across the floor were disturbing, but science would provide confirmation. Swabs, samples, and fibers were collected and rushed to the state lab. Days later, the results returned. DNA on the sweatshirt, hair strands on the mattress, and traces of saliva on a soda can. Each one matched Emily. She had been there. The barn that had been cleared countless times was now the confirmed site of her last moments. The realization sent a chill through both investigators and the community. For years, deputies had searched that very building with dogs, flashlights, and cadaver tests, only to declare it empty. Yet the truth had been sealed inside. Just beyond a false wall that blended so perfectly with the original boards, it fooled even trained eyes. Forensic carpenters later examined the construction and determined that the hidden chamber was built intentionally, not hurriedly. Whoever had created it had taken time to age the wood, to stain and weather the planks so they looked no different than the rest of the barn. It was craftsmanship designed to deceive, and it had worked. That detail shifted the investigation sharply. If the hidden room had been constructed before Emily vanished, then someone with access to the barn had built it with a purpose. If it had been built after, then someone had gone to incredible lengths to conceal evidence. Either way, it pointed toward someone familiar with the property, someone who knew its rhythms, who could come and go without arousing suspicion. Theories that once focused on strangers now tilted back toward insiders. Detectives pulled old employment records, revisiting every farmhand who had worked on the property in the years leading up to 2012. They looked closely at contractors, relatives, and neighbors who had reason to be near the barn. The carpentry alone suggested skill. Whoever built that chamber wasn't improvising. They knew how to cut boards flush, how to disguise nails, how to blend new wood with old. That kind of detail narrowed the list of possibilities. Meanwhile, the Harris family was forced to face a new and horrifying truth. For 8 years, they had walked past that barn daily. They had locked its doors, kept it standing, and lived in its shadow. And all that time, their daughter had been there, hidden behind a wall only feet away. The guilt was crushing. Sarah wept when investigators confirmed the DNA results. She remembered how she had begged deputies in the early days to look harder inside the barn. They had searched, reassured her it was clear, and moved on. But she'd never been wrong about it. Emily had been right there, within arm's reach, while searchers and family stood outside calling her name. The discovery also reignited anger at law enforcement. Locals questioned how so many searches could have missed such a space. Deputies defended their work, explaining that without cause to dismantle walls, they couldn't justify tearing apart private property. The false wall had been expertly done, showing no visible seam, no odd angles. Still, for many, that explanation felt thin. The idea that a child could have been trapped inside while searchers circled the barn was almost too painful to accept. The forensic analysis went further. Soil samples collected beneath the chamber showed traces of organic matter consistent with human remains, though degraded. It suggested Emily may have died there, her body once present before being moved. That detail rattled detectives. If her remains had been inside, who had removed them? And when? The chamber raised questions that cut deeper with each new finding. Had she been alive for days, hearing the searchers outside? Had she cried out, unheard behind thick boards? How long had she survived before the silence took her? The community wrestled with these possibilities in hushed tones. People avoided the farm altogether, unable to face what it represented. The barn was no longer just a place of whispers. It was proof of something calculated, something cruel. Parents warned their children never to go near it, even though it now stood sealed with police tape. To them, it was cursed ground. For detectives, the focus shifted to timing. When exactly had the hidden room been built? Old photographs of the barn were pulled from county records and family albums. In some, the wall where the chamber was found looked slightly different, suggesting modifications had been made within a narrow window before Emily vanished. That realization pointed even more directly at someone with opportunity. The false wall wasn't ancient, it was recent, constructed for a purpose tied to her disappearance. Every new piece of evidence built toward a horrifying realization. Emily's vanishing wasn't the work of chance or bad luck. It wasn't a random predator passing through. It was deliberate. Someone with knowledge of the farm had planned for her to be hidden, had built a chamber meant to contain her, and had kept that secret buried for years. The barn hadn't simply concealed her by accident. It had been designed to. The hidden room had finally spoken. But what it revealed wasn't closure. It was terror. And though investigators had confirmed Emily had been there, the larger question remained unanswered. Who had built the room, and why had they been so certain it would never be discovered? When the false wall was uncovered and DNA confirmed Emily had been inside the hidden chamber, investigators knew the next step was to determine who had built it. The construction was deliberate and skilled, requiring not only carpentry knowledge but also uninterrupted time in the barn. That narrowed the field of suspects, and soon, attention turned to someone whose name had appeared repeatedly in the farm's employment records, a man named Richard Hale. Hale had worked as a farmhand for nearly 5 years, leading up to Emily's disappearance. Locals remembered him as quiet, almost invisible. He was the type of man who blended into the background, rarely speaking unless spoken to, always completing his work without complaint. He had no close family in town, no real friends, and no history of trouble with law enforcement. But one detail stood out. In the days after Emily vanished, Hale himself disappeared. He left behind no forwarding address, no notice to the Harris family. He was simply gone. At the time, deputies had noted his absence but dismissed it as a coincidence. He was a drifter, they reasoned. People like him came and went. With no evidence tying him to the case, suspicion moved elsewhere. Now, with the hidden room exposed, that coincidence no longer looked harmless. Detectives began retracing his steps, combing through employment files, pay stubs, and Social Security records. The trail was faint at first, but with persistence they found fragments, a motel receipt in a nearby county, then a seasonal job in Arkansas under a slightly altered spelling of his name. Piece by piece, a pattern emerged. He had moved steadily south, shedding his identity like old skin. 8 years later, the search finally ended in Oklahoma. Detectives located him living in a small trailer on the outskirts of a rural town under a new name. He worked odd jobs kept to himself and avoided drawing attention. When officers approached, he didn't resist. Neighbors later recalled how calm he looked as he was led away in handcuffs, as though he had been waiting for this moment for years. During interrogation, the mask cracked. Hale initially denied involvement, claiming he had left the farm before Emily disappeared. But when confronted with the evidence, the DNA in the hidden room, the construction of the false wall, his sudden departure, the weight of silence collapsed. He began to speak, haltingly at first, then with chilling clarity. He admitted he had lured Emily into the barn that morning. He told her he needed help moving something, a request she wouldn't have questioned. Once inside, he forced her into the hidden chamber he had already prepared. For days, she was trapped there. Hale confessed he had provided little food and water, terrified of being discovered. The sound of deputies and searchers outside the barn only heightened his panic. He claimed Emily had begged to be let out, but fear of exposure kept him from acting. Within days, she grew too weak to cry out. She died from dehydration while her family searched only feet away. His words were almost clinical, devoid of remorse, but his fear of being caught was evident. After Emily died, Hale panicked. He sealed the chamber more tightly, aging the wood with stains and dirt to make it blend seamlessly with the rest of the barn. He left the sweatshirt and wrappers inside but removed her body, burying it in a shallow, remote location he later refused to disclose. Then he fled town, believing he had erased his tracks. For 8 years, his secret held until renovation exposed what he had tried to bury. The confession devastated the Harris family. For years they had lived with uncertainty, torn between hope and despair. Now they were forced to confront a truth worse than either. Their daughter had been trapped so close, calling for them while they searched outside. Sarah wept when detectives relayed the details, her grief compounded by the knowledge that Emily hadn't vanished into thin air. She had been stolen and silenced in the very heart of their farm. For investigators, the confession brought a grim relief. The mystery that had haunted the town was finally resolved. Hale was charged with kidnapping, unlawful confinement, and murder. Prosecutors vowed to pursue the harshest sentence possible. In court, Hale sat expressionless as the charges were read, his eyes downcast, never meeting the gaze of the family seated only feet away. The jury needed little convincing. The evidence of the hidden room, the DNA, and his own words sealed his fate. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the community, the revelation was both closure and a new source of horror. The quiet farmhand they had overlooked for years had been the architect of the town's greatest tragedy. He had worked beside them, shopped in the same stores, passed them on the same roads, all while harboring a secret room designed to hold a child. Parents who had once dismissed him as harmless now replayed every memory with unease. How could no one have seen it? How had he gone unnoticed for so long? Though the conviction brought justice, it could not erase the haunting image of Emily trapped in that barn, her voice unheard, her life stolen in silence. The truth about the farmhand had finally surfaced, but the shadow of what he had done lingered. For the Harris family, the story wasn't just about a man who confessed. It was about the barn that had stood for 8 years with its secret sealed inside, and the daughter they could not save. When investigators returned to the barn after the farmhand's confession, they carried shovels, evidence bags, and a quiet dread. Though he claimed to have buried Emily elsewhere, fresh searches of the hidden chamber revealed what had been missed before. In the floor beneath the mattress, forensic teams uncovered disturbed soil packed tight beneath warped boards. It was here, within the very walls of the barn, that fragments of bone and personal items were found. DNA analysis confirmed what the Harris family had feared and long suspected. Their daughter's remains had been there all along. The recovery brought a grim kind of closure. After nearly a decade of torment, the family finally had the answer to the question that had consumed them. Emily had not run away. She had not been spirited off to another state or taken by some faceless stranger. She had been trapped, silenced, and hidden within feet of where her parents and neighbors had once stood calling her name. That knowledge landed with unbearable weight. For Sarah, the detail that haunted her most was remembering the bloodhounds circling at the barn doors, whining, unable to push further. The dogs had been right. Her daughter had been on the other side, alive, waiting, unheard. The trial of Richard Hale drew national attention, courtrooms filled with reporters, cameras flashing as the quiet, unassuming farmhand sat shackled in his chair. Prosecutors laid out the evidence piece by piece: the hidden room, the DNA, the sweatshirt, the remains. Hale's confession was played aloud, his voice steady as he described luring Emily into the barn and leaving her to die. The jury listened in silence, their faces hardening with each detail. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, the room erupted in muffled sobs and gasps. Hale was sentenced to life in prison, but for the Harris family, no punishment could balance what had been taken. In town, the trial's end did not ease the fear. Instead, it deepened it. Locals whispered about the fact that Emily had been right there, inside the barn, while hundreds of searchers combed the fields, creeks, and woods. They whispered about how deputies had cleared the barn multiple times, pronouncing it empty, while a child waited behind the false wall. The horror lay not only in what Hale had done, but in how close everyone had been to saving her. Parents found themselves replaying those days, remembering how they had walked through the barn or stood beside it, unaware that the silence inside was hiding a child's cries. The barn itself became a monument to the tragedy. Even after the trial ended, no one in the community could pass it without glancing away. Some suggested tearing it down, believing that erasing it might ease the memory. Others argued it should stand as a reminder of what had happened, a warning never to dismiss the unexplainable. For the Harris family, the decision was simple. They never wanted to see it again. The barn had swallowed their daughter whole, and its shadow would never leave them. Emily's funeral was held nearly 9 years after her disappearance. The church overflowed with mourners, neighbors, and strangers alike, drawn by the haunting nature of her story. A small coffin carried her remains, and photographs of her at 14 lined the walls. People spoke not only of grief, but of the cruel irony that she had been so close all along. The service ended with silence, the congregation standing together in the kind of quiet that only comes when words are not enough. As months turned into years, the memory of Emily Harris continued to haunt the county. Parents told their children the story as both warning and sorrow, explaining why the old barn at the end of the lane stood locked and avoided. The farmhand's conviction provided justice on paper, but justice could not erase the reality that for 8 years the barn had kept its secret, refusing to reveal the truth until renovation forced it open. Even now, locals describe the land differently. They speak of the farm as though it still carries her presence, a reminder of how close salvation had been and how final the silence became. The barn remains standing, weathered and gray, its boards creaking in the wind. No one works inside it anymore. No one dares. To the community, it is not just a structure but a grave, a place where a child's life was stolen, where a family's hope was crushed, and where a town's innocence was shattered. Emily's name is still spoken in lowered voices, her story retold with trembling detail. And each time, the conclusion is the same. She had been there all along, mere feet from where searchers stood. The barn had held its secret for 8 years, and though the truth has finally been unearthed, the shadow of that silence will never leave.